Working in local government and working on the ground, there's nothing I hate more than an out-of-town consultant that comes in and says, look at all these great things that all these communities are doing that apply nothing to you. You have different laws, you have different funding sources. So we could talk about what other communities are doing, but I could also help you think through how that relates to the work here in Pennsylvania. So I like to kind of start with this, which is the cycle of vacancy, right? How did we get here and what continues to perpetuate this cycle? And this chart or circle or graphic, whatever you call it, I think gives a pretty succinct summary of what that is. So you have all of these things that contribute to inequity, right? Government policies of the past, discriminatory lending, unjust land use, all of these things that have contributed to vacancy and abandonment, which also impacts market demand, which also then leads to increased vacancy, which then also leads to all of the impacts that you have all heard today, right? Amanda and Suzanne and who else this morning talked about all of the impacts of vacancy, which then again contributes to all of these inequities. So the goal is, how do you stop this cycle, right? That's the ultimate goal. So I want to know, how do you all identify blight in your community? I'm going to call on people if you don't.
It's right on the main road.
Okay, but what is it, how do you know it's blight?
The windows are broken out.
Okay, broken windows?
Grass is high.
Grass is high, okay.
Holes in the walls.
Okay. How else?
Garbage in the yard.
Garbage in the yard?
Mail in the mailbox.
Yes.
Overgrown.
Does this look blighted to you?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So all the things that you all shared is what you see, right? It's what you see when you drive down the street. However, the things you don't see are the things that we all need to be thinking about, to think about what causes that visceral image you see that you know is bad, but what causes it? So the sort of iceberg analogy that I always use is, this is what you see, but this is what you don't see that contributes to that. So ownership. You know, talked about this morning the importance of understanding your inventory and identifying, is it, for smaller communities and bigger communities alike, is it sort of one or two owners that have a lot of the properties that are causing the blight? Is it market demand? There simply isn't market demand, and how do we sort of stimulate that? Is that LRTA? Is that a tax abatement? Is that simply just focusing on more demolitions? Is that building capacity in your community to actually develop the properties on the back end? In my experience, and this is the geekiest, nerdiest stuff that I won't spend too much time on, I can almost say 99% of the communities I've worked in, the biggest cause is inefficient and ineffective laws. So the inability for you all to do your jobs, to collect taxes before they become delinquent, and or when they become delinquent, to be able to actually transfer that property to a responsible owner. How many code enforcement people do we have in the audience? Okay. Do you all feel like your laws are sufficient for you to do your job?
For the most part, yes, but some of our ordinances need to be tightened up.
Okay. And is it a matter of just changing the local ordinance or changing state law?
Probably our local.
Local? Okay. How about some other code enforcement folks? Do you feel like you have the laws on the book? Let's not talk about capacity, because I'm sure you all can talk about capacity. But your local ordinances, the state ordinances, do you feel like you have the legal framework to do your job? Yes? No?
I would say like you might, like we do, but the process to get there is not may not be there.
Yep. And that's more about sort of the status and cost, like what happens to, what do you have the capacity and the manpower to sort of enforce the statute or the ordinance to actually get it to compliance, which is really your ultimate goal. You can go to the next slide. So when we talk about what are the right tools, I boil it down to a very simple little phrase, which is fix it up, pay it up, or give it up. That's it. Number one, the owner must comply, right? Your goal is compliance. Your goal is not to displace anyone, to not do a demolition if you don't have to. So the first goal is fixing it up. And the most obvious tools to do that is code enforcement, is providing, the case management and support for vulnerable homeowners to make sure that they have the resources, to make sure they understand what they need to do. So your comment about making sure that you have that list of resources for people is so key. And can I throw out something else? When you send the letter to the homeowner or the property owner saying that they're in violation, changing some of the wording, simply changing some of the wording so it's not such a threat, but it's saying, we want to help you, call us, we want to figure this out. If you don't do this, yes, some things are going to happen, but there's actually been a lot of behavioral science studies. New Orleans has done an amazing job documenting. They changed the first 3 sentences in their letters to property owners. It changed the compliance rate. I don't know the exact percentage, but it was a heck of a lot. So just think about that. The second is if the property owner doesn't fix up the property, if you don't get compliance, guess what? They're going to have to pay because somebody has to fix it, right? And it's usually local government that comes in and has to fix it. But guess what? That shouldn't be on our dime. Taxpayers should not be paying the cost of irresponsible property owners. So the key is, how do you get that cost recovery? How do you get that money back? So the second is really paying it up. And, the most obvious, again, tools are making sure that you recover your costs from the code enforcement perspective. So making sure that those fines transfer into liens that actually get recorded so that when that property may go up for sale or get sold, they're going to have to pay it up, right? And I'm curious, how many people know, in your community, do you actively file code enforcement liens on the properties? I see a few. Okay. Does anyone, is it absolutely routine with every single property, or is there some discretion? Discretion? Routine? Okay. Who said discretion? Would you be willing to share what?
Every situation is different.
Okay.
You have to look at resources that the homeowner has available. I take the strong stance, if you own a property, you're responsible. If you can't pay, then you shouldn't have that property. But, that's like kicking people out of their home. So
Yeah.
you have to look at, well, if they don't have the resources, is there some other resource to help them? If the municipality pays money to take care of the problem, yes, we need to get paid for that. You put a lien on the property. Problem is, the property could be sold, or I'm sorry, not sold, foreclosed upon.
Okay.
Financial institution never files that they take ownership.
But there's,
Then what do you do? So it poses additional problems moving forward. So
Yep.
every instance you have to look at, it's not that you're not being consistent, but you have to do the what ifs.
mm-hmm.
If this occurs, what's your next step, and so forth. Sometimes it's a long process. But a lien, really, I've had people laugh at me. Go ahead and slap it on me. I don't care, because when it sells, I don't care.
But
Because
how could it be sold if there's still a lien on that property?
They have to satisfy the lien.
Yeah.
But truthfully, a lot of times when a person gets to an age that they're so old, they don't care. They have that attitude, well, I don't have to pay it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a zero interest loan because they don't have to do anything.
Got it.
They'll just say, go ahead, put the lien on, you fix it, and that's it. we have to wait until the property's sold properly,
Yeah.
or if the bank forecloses, that they file the deed and that they take the ownership. Otherwise, it will sit there. So that's the problem with a lot of municipalities. You can spend money, then have to wait to get your money.
Yes.
If you get it.
If you
Yes.
get it, you're right.
Patience is a virtue, which I don't have, and I don't think a lot of local governments have. So I get that. But I think, sir, that you bring up a really important point, which is when we're talking about tools, and we'll get to the give it up part, you have to look at all of these tools very differently. For vacant, unoccupied nuisance properties have one strategy, right? And those are sometimes the easiest properties, honestly. If you actually apply the tools, if you actually file liens, you do all that, you can actually usually get that property, especially if it's tax delinquent, to some type of tax sale, right? You may not get your money back, but at least if you don't get paid up, could you at least transfer it to a responsible owner to get that property back on the tax rolls? The other category is occupied properties. And what you talked about is property owners who are occupying the property but are seriously struggling financially or otherwise, right, to do it. So I think that is really important to have that second category, to really think through what are the support services that you can use. You know, you talked about the small town that people want to help. You should offer that to everybody, but especially for those people who are vulnerable, that's so important. But for the third category, for people who have simply walked away and say, I don't care if you slap it on, that's the properties that we have to figure out how to use every single tool at our disposal to hold them accountable. And the last tranche of the give it up is, if the property owner doesn't fix it up, if they don't pay you for you fixing it up, then they got to give it up. And this is really where your condemnation process, where your land bank, right, is the tool to basically accept these properties so many times. And I get it. I mean, when I worked in local government in Pittsburgh, we did not want any more properties to take care of, right? And to be quite honest, and no offense, local governments aren't the greatest property managers, right? That's not what you're supposed to do, and you really don't have the resources for it. So I get that the give it up makes sense on paper, but if you don't have a partner like a land bank, if you don't have other responsible people who want to get the property, it's tough. I'm curious, right now in terms of partners in your community besides the land bank, do you have active nonprofit or mission-driven developers that will take the property from a tax sale or otherwise? Yeah?
I mean, the CDC in Washington.
Yeah. How about outside of Washington?
We're developing a CDC, but we're like in the very beginning of it, and we're mostly focusing on like the downtown area.
Well, you got to prioritize, right? You don't have all the resources, so. Who else? What other partners do you all have? Let me ask a different question. Who is the most strangest partnership that you've had to date in your jobs? Maybe a partner that nobody else would even think about approaching in their community. Please.
I've actually approached business owners.
Okay.
You know, not that that's strange or anything. You can actually go to, we're partnering more with the redevelopment of the land bank, Central Westmoreland Habitat. Partnering more with them. And there's more in the pipeline too, where we want to do like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and church organizations as well.
So do you look at what you want that property to be and then choose who the partner is? Or do you go to the partner and then you figure that out together?
Actually, if you have the effort and time, I strategize beforehand, knowing if I know the capabilities of that organization, what best suits that organization. So that's what we try to do.
We can go to the next slide.
There's a lot of different organizations that we still tap into to do that. So.
How about others? How are you figuring out what the heck you want to happen to these blighted properties. I mean, how are you figuring out what success looks like and who your partners are? Did you have your hand up?
House flippers are our greatest.
The what?
House flippers are our
Okay.
greatest asset. You know, they come in, they take a property, and we keep track of and let them know that there's a house that's available, that they could come in and swoop in and fix it up and make it from a multi-family unit that's where you have an absentee landlord or a delinquent landlord, and that this is an opportunity to fix it up, and then they usually make it into a single-family house rather than that slumlord type of place.
Is the primary method through the tax sale?
Yes.
Okay. And so do they go, I always forget what the first sale is called.
Repository.
They're-
No. Upset.
Is it
Upset.
Upset. Upset, then judicial, right? Okay. So is it at the upset, do you know? Is it the
I
first?
don't know.
Okay. Do you also, I will get to you in 1 second. Do you also have figured out what resources are needed if those house flippers are your primary partner? Do they ask for additional resources?
We give them as much information as we possibly can, without violating anybody's rights, privacy.
Got it.
You ask who the partners are.
Yeah.
You can get developers and so forth, but you definitely have to consider your school district and county. Because if you're gonna offer any type of tax abatement or tax learning program, you have to go through them. And a lot of your developers, that's what they look for.
Yeah.
Now, I do wanna ask you something.
Please,
or
bring it.
everybody here. We had property in Scottsdale, it was horrible. Now, if it's a cash transaction, we don't really see it until the lien, or not the lien, the deed
The
is
deed.
filed. So what happens is, on the internet, you have prospectors. They'll buy property sight unseen, resell it for more than what they purchased it, make money on it, and we still have the problem sitting there. Do you know, I mean, you probably are familiar with it, but what information would you have there as far as trying to stop that and finding a partner that would be a true partner? Because it was a local individual that bought the property. I called around to different municipalities. He did very well for them. But for my property in my town, he just let it sit there. Then he sold to somebody out of California, then someone else, and it's a cash transaction. So when we see it, it's when they file for the deed. We were lucky that there was another local person that when he came in, we were talking, and I just said, his name was Ronnie. I said, Ronnie, I'm going to tell you something. We've been burned by prospectors. Somebody made money, and that property is still blighted, and it's fallen in. If you're going to do something, I want an affidavit, and I want seriousness on this, because I can't be burned again. He was honest enough by coming in and discussing, and we got a property that was fixed up because of that. But what if he didn't come in? So that's
Is
something
the
to be
property
aware of.
current on taxes?
What's that?
Is the property current on taxes, property
Yes,
taxes?
the individuals that
Okay.
were buying the property just paid the taxes and that's it.
From a code enforcement perspective, were you continuing to cite, fine, lien, all of that?
Well, we went for the property owner we thought, and then next thing you know, we had to wait to find out, because we weren't aware of the transaction, then we finally, it was then put on the county books for the new buyer, for the new owner, then, we'd go after them. But like I say, we're being burnt because somebody's earning money on a property, and not one thing was done with the blighted property during that time until the final person was honest enough and then did something that brought some tax money plus value, more value because of fixing it up.
How many others have dealt with this situation? And what have you done?
I mean, we have to start our enforcement over,
Yeah.
obviously. So, I mean, we see it quite a bit in Altoona. I mean, we really do. And people are as bold as putting it out on our community Facebook pages. Like our Altoona area groups or whatever. you know, they'll just kind of throw something on there. I buy out of town houses, I buy houses that aren't ready for the market, and before you know it, you know, so we actually try to monitor those sites for that. We actually try to monitor like Craigslist, as bad as that is, but we have to. We have found so many people that are trying to do it, and we try to stay ahead of it, but it still happens.
And is it the same situation where there's the property taxes are current, but the physical structure of the house is a blight?
The physical condition of the house is poor. It's always poor. It's always something that the owner is ready to walk away from or already has walked away from. The thing is, there are usually some taxes owed, and it seems like what's happening in my experience with it is the new buyer promises to pay the taxes in exchange for the house, is really all it amounts to. They might give actually some extra to the seller.
Okay.
But they get it just enough to cover the taxes. They might throw them some money as well, and then that's it. And then it sits. And these people might live in, well, I mean, we know where they're from, but they're not from our area at all. I mean, some are as far as California.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and if other folks, what I'm trying to figure out is there seems to be a break with your two main systems, which is either code enforcement or delinquent tax enforcement. So I'm trying to figure out what the break is. It doesn't seem like in these cases it's tax enforcement. So if there's not citations and enforcement and liens being enforced, which is the mechanism, right, to at least get them to pay for any of the costs you're doing. But if a property is in poor condition, but it's not, you can't condemn it, it's not a demo candidate, I'm not quite sure what else you can do. I mean, have others had other strategies of just properties that sit there that are just in poor condition but not quite condemned?
Fine them.
Like, so that's what I'm saying is, yeah, fine them. You have to make them pay for it. And if they don't pay, then they have to give it up. Go ahead.
We had success using Act 90. And we were a little nervous because it was an LLC with some deep pockets, so we didn't know if we were going to get challenged on it. We didn't. But since I'm with a COG, we reached out to all of our COG members and asked them to identify properties that LLC owned, and if they had any tax delinquency, unpaid garbage fees, unpaid sewage, whatever, because Act 90 will allow you to attach all that. And we denied permit to that LLC, and they did. They paid up. They cut the grass where they needed to.
So that was the lever. That's really where it hit them, was not being able to get a permit.
Yeah.
So what if they never came in to get a permit though?
Yeah, well then Act 90 would be the right tool.
You know what I mean? That's because we just have a few of those out there that, I mean, we just don't know what to do.
I can give you an example from another community, but before we do that, other folks from the area that have other tools that maybe have been helpful in cases like this, please.
I'm from the city of Erie, and
Okay.
we have a blighted property review committee, and unfortunately, so we file, once the property is declared blighted by the committee, and we file the declaration of blight. But the city of Erie also has a ordinance that prevents the transfer of ownership of a blighted property. It doesn't stop the quick claim deeds of somebody transferring title without checking, that title history on the property, but it does show up when you do have somebody who wants to legitimately check the back history of a property, and they see that, the transfer of ownership is there and they can't transfer that issue, so that stops that. But, the blight notice and through that system, they transfer it all day long, our blight notice is still on the property, and, if it continues to sit there, we're gonna act upon that. And then that's our mechanism to keep those prospectors, those asset companies from continuing to prey on the neighborhood. It's only going to happen so long before we're going to act upon our.
So you would act upon the demo? Is that what it would be?
Yeah, we'll act upon blight notice, file condemnation against the property, and and in most instances, those out of town buyers don't contest us in court. We'll acquire the property and then either convey it through. In the city of Erie, we have a robust network of neighborhood organizations. We have the Erie Neighborhood Growth Partnership that brings together all those neighborhood organizations, and we collaborate together. And so if we have a property within a neighborhood organization, we'll speak with them see if they're interested in acquiring that property if we do take ownership of it, and have that mechanism in place ahead of time to just convey it to them once we complete the condemnation process, so that now that neighborhood group who is invested in that neighborhood has, whatever mechanism to take it to the next step, would take ownership of it. Whether it is the property or we demolish it, we try to make sure we have that at least in place, when we have a neighborhood group area to work with it.
Basically, when you deal with the tax delinquency, it makes it simpler.
Yep.
Because we've gotten notice from the county when something's going through the process.
Okay.
They'll say, hey, this property is gonna go through the process and be sold. Do you have any concern, delinquencies or?
And who do you
code
represent? Are you you're in a borough or?
Yes, a
Okay.
borough here in
Okay.
Westmoreland County.
Mhm.
But they do send out a notice at that time if it's a tax sale or it's up for tax sale, because the community has a right to say, well, we've got liens on it, or there's violations, and so forth. And based upon that, the county then, I believe, has a step that they take that they can stop the sale to that individual, and maybe the next person bidding would be allowed to purchase that through the tax sale. So, because
they send us to a list of who is registered that wants to purchase properties in tax sales.
And that's a relatively new law, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Yeah, that's
fairly
new.
new. They didn't do that always, and that's helpful too. So you can look and see who's registered for the sale.
But that's where that makes it simple when there's a tax issue.
Mm-hmm.
Take that out of the way, then you have to investigate more and have the headache of trying to make sure that that property, you either get the liens taken care of and the property's up and it takes extra steps. So I'd rather somebody owe taxes and not get that notice. It makes it simpler.
If you have a good, predictable, and equitable tax foreclosure or collection process, I agree. It could be definitely. A lot of communities don't have that, so sometimes they do actually want to go through code enforcement, and then they basically have been able to use that code enforcement lien as a first priority lien equal to taxes to try and go through that foreclosure process. The other thing that I have found to be very successful when it comes to code enforcement is instead of going after the person, you go after the property. So it's called in rem enforcement. And so it's not criminal enforcement, because I found if people walk away or if people are really savvy, they're going to figure out how not to be found, right? But if you're actually going after the property itself, right, and doing the constitutional adequate notice, all of that, it makes it easier, right? Because you can show through a judicial in rem process, you could show a judge, hey, we've done all this notice, we've done all of this, we would like to proceed on a foreclosure. And I'm not clear whether anyone in Pennsylvania is doing that. And do you all have a sense of whether that judicial in rem against the property, not the person, is happening for code enforcement? Yeah.
I think our solicitor pursued that at one point, and we could not find the property owner.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
And?
ask a silly question.
No, please.
Can you spell that? Because I gotta go look this up.
Yes. Yes.
I was like, what? Spell
Totally.
that, please?
Yeah, I pretend like I'm a lawyer, but I'm totally not. But I work with a bunch of them. So it's called judicial in rem, R-E-M. So in rem is basically the Latin term for place, property. And I honestly, you could see why that would be a more effective process, right, for a certain category of properties. In some communities, we found that it has to be a change in state law. So that's just the question I have. I'm not sure from Pennsylvania law perspective, but it might be really worth looking into. Again, if you don't want to create a whole new system, but if for that tranche of properties where it really is a matter of not finding the property owner, could you simply use a different enforcement process to get that property, again, transferred to a new owner? That's the ultimate goal. Questions? thoughts? Please, go ahead.
How do you get your community involved? It's just a small rural town.
Did everyone hear the question? How do you get your community involved?
Especially if it's a small rural town.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I think I've seen it done in various ways, and I think it really depends on the capacity of the local government and the culture, right? I mean, do people come to meetings? Do more people respond to letters? Is it a matter of putting it on the public, television station? Is it a matter of, using mobile phones to get notices out there? Is it a matter of creating a Facebook page, I'm amazed at how many older people in my family know so much more about Facebook than I do. So I think it's really figuring out what works for your community. And I think rural communities are definitely, could be harder in some sense. I would also argue that sometimes those communities are much more tight-knit, where people know each other, right? You know the person who's lived down that street for generations. But I guess that's a question for you all. How are you all engaging your community in code enforcement, tax enforcement, all of that? Is it letters? Is it community meetings? Is it Facebook? What is it? I didn't hear that.
He said a letter.
Letter? Okay. Is it a letter to let them know that they are in violation, or is it a letter to get input and to sort of engage them in education and all of that?
Just if they're in violation.
Okay. Do you find that people in your community understand what happens and what it means to be in violation?
I think they understand it.
I don't know who it is that's speaking. I can't see. Oh, please.
I think they understand. I think their first reaction is, well, my neighbor has that, or he burned on Tuesday. That's usually what happens. But usually it's, usually a letter first.
But
it's
you're
a soft letter saying, hey. But then if the letter's on, if they don't answer the letter or whatever, then the ordinance guy physically goes up.
How about others?
Depends on the purpose.
Yep.
So when we do our tax credit programs, we're very trying to engage the community. It's more group meetings, and surveys, and getting input from the community on projects, and probably depends on purpose, what you're trying to get out of it.
Oh, time for one more? Yeah. Thank you. One more question or thought or anything that folks want to, even other strategies for, please.
Well, just in follow-up to that last point, I have a community that does block sweeps, but before they do that, in their garbage bill and in their newsletter, they'll send out a flyer and say, this is what we're going to be looking for and here's why. And it's in a very friendly, the flyer is very friendly and, happy, sunny community graphics, but just to educate people, you do have to keep your grass under this. You can't have chipping, peeling paint. You do have to have a railing if you have so many steps, that kind of stuff. And then they go out and do the sweep.
Yeah. I mean, in general, and I don't mean to dumb this down, but I have found that the most successful engagement is authentic engagement. It's because you actually really want to know what the person's needs and wants are, right? Or their concerns. I think we've all been to meetings where people are just talking at you and they have they don't care at all what people, what the information is. So I think really figuring out, again, to your point, what the purpose is and what you want to get out of it, and then what is your capacity? What can you do? What can you do? Because if it's a matter of scaling it back, but it's going to be more impactful to actually have a meeting or to do some door knocking or whatever, then that might be the strategy to use. I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I think given the technology these days, it's getting harder to figure out, or maybe it's easier for some folks to figure out what to deploy. So, okay. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. And if anyone, here, just go to the last slide. If anyone has, keep on going. Keep on going. If anyone would like to contact me or Community Progress, I think my information is in the booklet, but please feel free to go to our website. I hope you all join us for our national conference in Chicago in September, which is going to be great. How many people have come? Reclaiming vacant properties? Yeah?
Trying to come.
Yes, good. Thank you all very much.